The wind howled across the Texas plains like a wounded beast, dragging the scent of smoke and iron through the air. Evelyn Hart stumbled through the ashes of what had once been her father's homestead, her dress torn, her throat raw from screaming. Behind her, the horizon still glowed red, barns burning, horses crying, and the night alive with the war whoops of Comanche warriors. They had come at dusk, swift as shadows painted in streaks of red and black. Evelyn had seen death before. She had buried her mother and 2 brothers when fever swept through their settlement. But this was different. This was violence alive and breathing. It had eyes, hands, and a language of thunder. She remembered her father's last command, hissed as he shoved her toward the root cellar. "Hide. Don't you dare make a sound." She'd hidden, trembling, while the world above her roared and cracked. But when silence finally fell, it wasn't safety that came, it was footsteps. Heavy, measured, stopping just above the cellar door. When it opened, moonlight cut through the darkness like a blade. A man stood there, broad-shouldered and tall, his hair braided and marked with feathers. His chest was bare, but for a necklace of bear claws. War paint streaked his face, black across the eyes, red over the mouth. His gaze found hers, sharp and unflinching. For a moment, neither moved. Then he extended a hand. Evelyn didn't take it. He didn't grab her either. Instead, he spoke something low and rhythmic, words she couldn't understand but that carried a tone she recognized. Command, not cruelty. When she still refused, he sighed, bent, and lifted her as though she weighed no more than a bundle of cloth. She fought him, kicking, biting, clawing, but his grip was unyielding, neither rough nor gentle, simply absolute. He carried her into the dark, past the burning remains of her home, past the bodies she could not bear to look at. The night was thick with the smell of smoke and blood, yet somewhere in that chaos she thought she smelled cedar and sage, the scent that clung to him. By dawn, they had ridden far into the plains. Her hands were bound, her throat parched, her mind reeling. Around her, a dozen Comanche warriors rode in silence, their faces unreadable masks of paint and shadow. She felt like an intruder in another world, fragile and pale against the wild pulse of the prairie. Her captor, the one who had found her, rode at the front. The others deferred to him without question. His name, she would later learn, was Tahan, wolf who walks alone. But for now, she only knew him as the man who hadn't killed her when he easily could have. When the sun reached its highest, the war party stopped near a stream. Evelyn expected the end then, a knife, a rope, or something worse. Instead, they untied her hands and gave her water. One of the women, older and stern-faced, handed her a piece of dried meat. Evelyn hesitated, expecting mockery or poison, but the woman only grunted and walked away. Tahan watched her from a short distance, his expression unreadable. There was no pity in his eyes, only an unspoken curiosity. He gestured for her to eat. When she didn't, he said in slow, broken English, "You live. No die, understand?" She did, and that frightened her more than anything else. That night, as the warriors made camp beneath a canopy of stars, Evelyn sat apart, hugging her knees to her chest. The firelight painted their faces in gold and shadow. They laughed softly, shared food, sang in voices that carried like wind through the grass. It was human. That unsettled her, too. When Tahan approached, she flinched. He knelt beside her, his movements quiet, deliberate. He pointed at her, then at himself. "Tahan," he said. Then pointing again, "You?" Her voice cracked when she finally whispered, "Evelyn." He repeated it awkwardly, "Evelyn," the syllables strange on his tongue. Then he nodded once and stood, walking back to the fire. She stared after him for a long time. In the silence between heartbeats, something began to shift. The night no longer sounded like the echo of her father's sermons or the hymns of the church choir. It sounded older, like the earth breathing, and though she told herself she hated them, hated him, she couldn't shake the truth burning quietly in her chest. She was alive because of the man with the wolf's eyes. The days that followed blurred into an endless stretch of horizon and sky. The Comanche band rode like ghosts across the plains, swift, tireless, and silent. Evelyn had never known such vastness. The land rolled on forever, untamed and alive, whispering through the tall grass as if it carried secrets too ancient for words. Her captor, Tahan, rarely spoke. When he did, his voice was low and deliberate, the kind that seemed to come from deep within his chest. To the others, he was a leader. Though he gave few orders, they followed his every glance, every tilt of his head. Evelyn watched him with wary fascination, trying to decipher the language of his silence. He treated her not as a slave, but not as a guest either. She rode tied to one of the pack horses, yet she was fed, given water and shielded when storms rolled across the plains. Once, when the rain came in sheets, he tossed his buffalo hide cloak over her shoulders without a word and kept riding bare to the wind. When she tried to give it back, he simply looked ahead and said, "Keep." It was the first English word he'd spoken in 2 days. At night she would lie near the fire, pretending to sleep while the Comanche men murmured softly among themselves. Their words were fluid, melodic. She couldn't understand them, but she could feel their rhythm. It wasn't savagery she heard in their tones. It was life, families, friendship, grief. The same things that made up her own world, though hers had been painted in hymnals and sermons instead of fire and smoke. Still, fear was her constant companion. Every morning she woke expecting it to be her last. One evening, as the sun bled gold across the horizon, the band halted near a dry riverbed. Tahan dismounted first. His movements were always deliberate, measured, patient, like a man who had learned long ago that rushing meant death. He handed his horse's reins to another warrior and walked toward the edge of the bluff, scanning the distance. Evelyn watched him, unable to look away. The wind lifted his hair, the fading light catching the faint scars that crossed his shoulder. They weren't random marks of battle, they were deliberate, ceremonial. She wondered what they meant. She wondered who had given them to him. Then, as if sensing her gaze, he turned. For a heartbeat their eyes met, his dark as riverstone, hers wide and unsteady. She quickly looked down, ashamed at being caught watching her captor like he was something to be understood. Later that night, one of the younger warriors tried to speak to her. His grin was too wide, his eyes too curious. Evelyn stiffened, clutching her blanket closer. The young man laughed and reached for her arm. Before his hand even touched her, Tahan was there. He moved like a striking wolf, fast, silent, final. His knife flashed once in the firelight, not to wound but to warn. The younger warrior froze, his smirk dying on his lips. A tense silence hung between them. Then without a word the youth backed away into the shadows. Tahan didn't look at Evelyn. He simply sheathed his blade and returned to his place by the fire. She sat there trembling, her pulse hammering in her throat. For a long time she didn't move. Finally she whispered into the darkness, "Why?" Though she knew he probably wouldn't understand. He didn't answer at first. But as he passed by her again, he said softly in that rough-edged English of his, "No harm." 2 words. That was all. Then he walked away. That night Evelyn couldn't sleep. The air was cold, the stars bright enough to cut. She turned those 2 words over and over in her mind. No harm. What kind of man protected a woman he'd taken captive? What kind of heartbeat inside the warrior they called Wolf Who Walks Alone? When she finally drifted into uneasy dreams, she saw flashes of fire, her home burning. Her father's voice shouting scripture, and then, strangely, the sound of a wolf's cry echoing across an endless field. She woke before dawn to find Tahan already awake, crouched by the fire, sharpening his knife. The blade gleamed, catching the first pale light of morning. He looked up, and for the first time she saw not a savage, not an enemy, but a man carved by loss, by duty, by a silence deeper than words could reach. And though she hated herself for it, Evelyn realized something terrifyingly human. She no longer feared him. She wanted to understand him. The days softened into rhythm: sunrise, ride, camp, stars. For the first time since her capture, Evelyn began to notice the quiet music of the plains instead of just its terror. The land was not empty as she had once believed. It breathed. Herds of bison darkened the horizon like living thunderclouds. Wildflowers trembled beneath the hooves of horses. The air was rich with the scent of sage and smoke, and the sky, vast and merciless, made her feel small but strangely free. The Comanche band moved with a grace that fascinated her. Every motion had meaning. They spoke little, but when they did, it was in gestures as much as words. A hand to the chest, a glance toward the hills, a smile that said more than speech. Evelyn began to mimic them without realizing it, her own language shifting into silence. She watched the women most of all. They tanned hides, wove cloth, and laughed softly among themselves. One of them, the elder who had first given her water, was named Mahina, which Evelyn learned meant Moon Woman. Though stern and proud, she seemed to tolerate Evelyn's presence, even teaching her small tasks: how to grind maize, how to braid horsehair, how to tell when the wind warned of storms. Evelyn's hands, once used for piano keys and sewing, grew rough and calloused, yet she found satisfaction in the work. Sometimes, when she caught her reflection in a pool of water, she barely recognized herself. Her hair was unbound, sun-bleached at the edges. Her face darkened by the sun, her eyes harder, older. She looked less like the preacher's daughter, and more like a creature born of dust and horizon. Tahan watched her quietly through all this, never intruding but always present. When they rode, he often fell back to keep pace with her horse. When the nights turned cold, he made sure her fire burned longest. But he never touched her, never crossed the invisible line of fear and pride that lay between them. Evelyn began to learn small pieces of his world, bits of the Comanche tongue, fragments of their songs. He taught her how to say water, sun, horse. She tried to teach him words in English. When he pointed to the sky and said Sioux, she smiled and answered sky. He repeated it clumsily, sky. She laughed before she could stop herself. For a heartbeat, he looked startled. Then he smiled too, the first real smile she had seen on his face. That night, laughter felt dangerous. It made her remember who she used to be. Still, the pull between them deepened, not with words but with moments. One evening, as the camp settled, she sat near the fire mending a torn sleeve. Across from her, Tahan cleaned his rifle, his movements smooth and methodical. The light flickered over his face, casting gold into his eyes. She wondered what he thought of her, if he saw her as fragile, as foolish, or as something else entirely. When she met his gaze, he held it, steady and unreadable. The silence between them was not cold. It was alive, trembling with the things neither dared to say. Days later, while gathering firewood near the river, Evelyn heard a low growl. A wolf, thin, wild, starving, emerged from the brush, its ribs sharp beneath its fur. It bared its teeth, eyes locked on her. She froze. The axe slipped from her hand. Then an arrow hissed past her shoulder, striking the ground near the wolf's paws. Another followed. The animal snarled, then vanished into the trees. When she turned, Tahan stood there, bow drawn, his eyes hard as flint. He said nothing, just lowered the bow and walked to her. She wanted to thank him, but the words tangled in her throat. He stopped before her, close enough for her to see the faint scar along his jaw, the pulse in his throat. You? Safe, he said, the words halting. Careful, She swallowed hard. Thank you. He inclined his head, then turned and walked away, leaving her with her heart hammering so loud she thought he must hear it. That night, she sat awake long after the fire died, staring into the dark. The world she had known, her father's sermons, the white clapboard church, the small dreams of marriage and safety, felt like a story from another life. Here, beneath the endless stars, another truth was forming, one she couldn't yet name. She was no longer just a captive. She was becoming something else, someone who belonged to both worlds, and to neither. And somewhere in the stillness, she knew that Tahan, the silent warrior who had taken her life apart, was the only one who could help her piece it back together. Thunder rolled over the plains like the growl of a sleeping god, and lightning stitched the horizon in white fire. The Comanche camp scattered to secure the horses and cover their supplies. Evelyn ran to help Mahina tie down the hides, rain soaking through her dress, wind whipping her hair across her face. The sky cracked open, drenching them in seconds. By nightfall, the camp had huddled beneath makeshift shelters of hide and brush. The storm still raged above, but within the circle of firelight there was warmth, laughter, and the smell of smoke and roasted corn. Evelyn sat close to the fire, her body shivering, though she wasn't sure whether from cold or something deeper. She peeled off her wet shawl and tried to dry it near the flames. Her thin cotton dress clung to her skin, and when she reached forward, the sleeve slipped back. The firelight caught the ridges along her arm, raised, pale scars twisting like old rivers beneath her skin. For a moment, no one noticed. Then Mahina's sharp eyes found them. The older woman froze, her mouth tightening, her gaze flicking to Tahan. Evelyn saw the question in both their faces. What kind of wound leaves such marks? Evelyn quickly pulled the sleeve down, heart pounding. "It's nothing," she murmured, though no one understood her words. She stood, meaning to leave, but Tahan rose too. His presence filled the small shelter, calm, quiet, unmovable. He said something to Mahina in their tongue, low and firm. The older woman nodded and turned away, leaving them alone with the sound of rain drumming on the hides. Evelyn stood rigid, her back to him. "Don't look at me," she whispered. "Please." But he did. He stepped closer, slow and careful, like approaching a wounded animal. He didn't reach for her. He only said, "Hurt." The word struck her like a memory. Her father's face flashed behind her eyes, his righteous fury, his hand gripping the fire poker. "The Lord disciplines those he loves," he had said, before pressing the iron to her arm for defying him, for daring to dream of a world beyond obedience. She squeezed her eyes shut, tears burning hot against her cheeks. "Not anymore," she said hoarsely. "It was a long time ago." He didn't understand the words, but something in her voice told him enough. He moved closer until he was within arm's reach, the air between them trembling. Slowly he lifted his hand, not to command, not to take, but to ask. Evelyn didn't move. Her breath caught when his fingers brushed the edge of her sleeve and pushed it back, revealing the scars fully. Lightning flashed, painting his face in pale light. Tahan's brow furrowed, not in disgust but in sorrow. He traced one of the scars lightly with the back of his fingers, so gently she barely felt it. Then, in a gesture that stole her breath, he bent his head and pressed his lips to her skin. The kiss wasn't passionate. It wasn't about desire. It was reverence, an unspoken vow. He murmured something in Comanche, the words deep and steady. She didn't understand, but she felt their meaning in her bones. When he finally looked up, his eyes were soft, like the edge of a storm fading. "Scars," he said, tapping his chest, searching for the right word. "Strong, you..." "Live." She stared at him, the meaning sinking in. "You lived." Her throat ached. "They're ugly," she whispered. He shook his head slowly. "No ugly." His voice was quiet, certain. "They talk, they say, heart fight." Something broke inside her then, not in pain, but in release. The tears came freely, silent and shaking. For so long her scars had been her shame, proof of her unworthiness. Yet here was a man, a warrior of another world, who looked at them and saw strength. He reached up, brushing a tear from her cheek with the back of his knuckles. The touch was so gentle it undid her. "Why are you kind to me?" she asked, though she didn't expect an answer. He looked at her for a long time, the firelight flickering in his eyes. Then he said in halting English, "Because I know hurt." He turned away then, stepping out into the rain, leaving her trembling in the glow of the dying fire. Outside, the storm began to fade. The thunder moved farther east and the scent of wet earth filled the air. Evelyn pressed her hands against her heart and whispered into the darkness. "You shouldn't care for me," but she knew, even as she said it, that something had changed between them. The scars she had hidden all her life had been seen and kissed, and she could never be the same again. Days passed after the storm, but the memory of Tahan's kiss lingered like the warmth of fire on Evelyn's skin. It haunted her, not because it frightened her, but because it didn't. She couldn't forget the way his voice had sounded when he said, "You live." The camp soon returned to its rhythm. The men rode out to hunt. The women tanned hides and ground maize, and the children played in the grass. Yet everything felt different now. The air between Evelyn and Tahan was charged with something unspoken. Every glance felt like a secret. Every silence a question neither dared to voice. One morning, as the sun spilled over the plains in gold light, Mahina approached Evelyn with a bundle of leather in her hands. Inside was a dress, simple, beautifully made, trimmed with beads and soft fringe. Mahina spoke a few words and gestured toward Evelyn's torn cotton dress, then toward Tahan, who stood a short distance away, speaking to another warrior. Evelyn's heart thudded. She didn't understand all the words, but she recognized one. Wife. The meaning hit her like a blow. The tribe believed Tahan had claimed her. Her hands trembled as she held the dress. "No," she whispered, though her voice carried no power here. "No, I can't," but Mahina only smiled, a mother's knowing smile, and walked away, leaving Evelyn standing in the morning light, the leather dress heavy in her hands that night. When Tahan returned, he found her sitting by the edge of the camp, staring at the dress beside her. She looked small against the vast sweep of twilight, her hair loose, her face drawn. He approached quietly the way he always did, never imposing but impossible to ignore. "Evelyn," he said softly. She flinched. She hadn't heard him speak her name since the storm. It still sounded strange and gentle on his tongue. She looked up, eyes shining in the firelight. "They think I'm to be your wife." He hesitated, then nodded once. "Yes," her throat tightened. "Why, I'm not one of you." "I'm not—" She stopped herself, but the words pressed hard against her heart. "I'm not good enough," he frowned, stepping closer. "Not good?" Her voice cracked, all the pain she'd carried spilling out at once. "I'm not what a wife should be. My father, he said I was wild, sinful, that no man would ever want me after what I'd done. And now I'm here among your people, dressed in rags with scars all over my body. Look at me." Her hands trembled as she gestured helplessly at herself. "How could I ever be enough for you?" Tahan's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes flickered. Something raw and old. Slowly, he walked forward until he stood before her. He lifted her chin with the edge of his hand, forcing her to meet his gaze. His eyes were dark, steady, filled with that quiet gravity she could never look away from. He touched his chest, then hers. "You heart," he said. Then with care, my heart, tears welled in her eyes. "You don't understand," but he did. He shook his head. "I understand hurt." His voice was rough, low. "My woman, my child gone. White men take fire, I fight. I live alone." Evelyn's breath caught. She hadn't known. He looked at her then, not with pity but with the calm certainty of a man who had survived loss and chosen to keep walking. "You think you not enough?" he said. "You fight storm. You live pain. You still see. That is strong." He reached out, tracing a line from her jaw to her shoulder. Not possessive, not claiming, but reverent. Then he took her hands and placed them flat against his chest. She could feel the steady drum of his heartbeat beneath her palms. "This," he said, pressing her hands there. "Say yes." Her lips trembled. "And if it says no?" He smiled faintly. "Then I wait." The fire cracked between them, its light flickering over their faces. The wind carried the faint sound of drums from the far side of the camp, a song of life, of love, of survival. Evelyn's tears fell freely now, not from sorrow, but from the breaking of a lifetime of walls. She whispered, her voice trembling, "I'm not good enough to be your wife." Tahan's answer was not in words. He stepped closer, his hand rising to her face. His thumb brushed her lips and then he leaned in, pressing his mouth to her scars, the ones on her arm. Her throat, her heart. He kissed them all, slow and deliberate, as if rewriting her story with each touch. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, steady as the earth beneath them. "You are enough," he said. "More than enough." The wind carried her sob into the night, where it dissolved among the stars. The night after her confession, Evelyn did not sleep. She lay awake listening to the steady rhythm of horses breathing and the faint crackle of dying embers. The storm had passed, but inside her another one had taken root. Tahan's words, "You are enough," echoed in her chest, steady as his heartbeat. She didn't know whether to believe him. In her world, men spoke love like law, conditional, weighed by duty and appearance, by a woman's obedience and purity. But Tahan's love, if that's what it was, felt different. It had no rules, no shame. It asked for nothing and yet demanded everything. When dawn came, she rose before the others, walking down to the river. Mist floated above the water like breath. She knelt and touched her reflection. Her face looked older, freer, as though the land itself had carved something new into her. Behind her came the sound of footsteps, quiet, familiar. Tahan. He crouched beside her without a word, his presence grounding her the way mountains anchor the horizon. For a while they said nothing. The river spoke for them, murmuring softly as it moved past their hands. "You always find me," she said finally. He smiled faintly. "You go far." She dipped her fingers into the cold current. "Maybe I wanted to be lost." He studied her for a moment, then said, "You not lost. You find new way." His words struck something deep in her like a spark catching dry grass. She turned to him. "Why do you care so much what happens to me? I'm not one of your people. I don't belong here." He met her gaze unflinching. "You belong where your spirit rests." She wanted to laugh, to tell him he didn't understand, but the truth was, He did. He saw her more clearly than anyone ever had. A hawk circled overhead, its cry cutting through the morning stillness. Tahan watched it, his eyes distant. "Hawk fly alone," he said softly, "but always see far." "You like that?" Evelyn looked away, blinking back sudden tears. "I wasn't brave," she whispered. "I just survived." He turned to her then, his expression changing, gentle, serious. To live is brave. Something inside her gave way. All the pieces she had hidden, fear, shame, longing, broke open like a river bursting its banks. "Why me?" she asked, her voice trembling. "You could have any woman in your tribe. Why choose one who came to you in chains?" Tahan's eyes softened. He reached out and took her hand, rough fingers closing over hers with the same care he gave a wounded horse. "Chains not always here," he said, touching her wrist. "Sometimes here." He tapped his chest. "And here." He brushed his temple. Her breath caught. He held her gaze. "When I see you first, you fight. You scream, you burn like fire, not afraid to look at death. I know then, you same as me." He paused, searching for words. "I see your heart before I touch your hand." Evelyn's throat tightened. For years she had been told that her heart was a flaw, that she felt too much, spoke too boldly, wanted too deeply. But Tahan didn't see those things as sins. He saw them as truth. He rose, pulling her gently to her feet. For a moment they stood there on the riverbank, the dawn wind tangling their hair together. He touched the small pendant around his neck, a claw, polished smooth by time, and slipped the leather cord over his head. He placed it in her palm. "My wife wear this once," he said quietly. "She walk with stars now. I keep to remember now." He closed her fingers around it. "I give to you, not to forget her, but because she teach me how to love strong. And you teach me how to love again." Evelyn's vision blurred. "Tahan, I can't." He shook his head, silencing her. "No must. You choose." The wind lifted the fringe of his tunic, the river gleamed silver behind him. Everything felt suspended, time, sound, the very breath of the world. Slowly, Evelyn slipped the pendant over her neck. The claw rested against her skin, warm from his touch. Tahan stepped closer, his hand rising to her cheek. This time she didn't pull away. He kissed her, not with hunger but with reverence, the kind that felt like a prayer spoken between two souls. The world around them dissolved, the river, the sky, even the ache of the past. When they parted, he whispered, "Now we both live." And for the first time in her life, Evelyn believed it. Peace never lasts long on the frontier. It comes like morning fog, soft, golden, and fleeting. For weeks, Evelyn lived in that fragile calm, her days unfolding with a rhythm that no longer felt foreign. She had become part of the tribe's breath. She helped grind maize, taught the children a few English words, and learned Comanche songs in return. At dusk, she and Tahan would sit beside the fire, sharing silence that was deeper than speech. Sometimes he would braid her hair. Sometimes she would trace the scars on his hands, feeling the history carved into them. They were two broken souls who had found a rhythm together, a life stitched between worlds. But one morning, while the air was still heavy with mist, the dogs began to bark. Tahan froze where he stood, head lifting like a wolf catching scent. The others looked toward the ridge, their laughter fading. Then came the sound, distant but unmistakable. Hoofbeats, many of them. Evelyn's heart stopped. Tahan's eyes met hers, sharp and knowing. "White men," he said. Before she could speak, he was already shouting orders in Comanche. The camp erupted into motion. Women grabbing children, men mounting horses, weapons flashing in the rising sun. Evelyn stood paralyzed, watching smoke curl from the fires, hearing the thunder of hooves draw nearer. "They've come for me," she whispered. Tahan turned to her, his expression unreadable. "They come for all." Moments later, gunfire shattered the stillness. The sound was wrong here, like blasphemy. Soldiers, blue coats and pale faces appeared on the ridge, rifles gleaming. Bullets tore through the air. Women screamed. Horses reared. The camp exploded into chaos. Tahan grabbed Evelyn's arm, pulling her behind a line of rocks. "Stay," he commanded. "No," she cried. "I can help." He hesitated only a second, then tossed her a rifle. "Then fight." Her fingers closed around the weapon. The wood was heavy, the metal cold. She had never fired one before, but instinct and terror guided her. She aimed toward the smoke and pulled the trigger. The recoil slammed into her shoulder. Somewhere in the haze, a man fell. Tahan's voice rang out above the din, deep and steady, commanding his warriors like thunder commands rain. Arrows sang through the air. The Comanche fought like wind, swift, fierce, everywhere at once. Evelyn reloaded with trembling hands. A bullet grazed her arm. Pain seared, but she didn't stop. She wasn't the frightened preacher's daughter anymore. She wasn't even the captive. She was alive, and the fire that burned in her chest was no longer fear. It was purpose. Then she saw him. A soldier on horseback, his uniform torn, his face streaked with grime, but familiar. Captain James Ward, her father's friend. The same man who had baptized her brother in the river and broken bread at their table. He was shouting her name, Evelyn! Evelyn Hart. We're here to bring you home. Home. The word struck her like a bullet. She turned, meeting his gaze across the chaos. For an instant, the battlefield fell silent. Then Tahan stepped between them. Captain Ward's rifle lifted. Get away from her, savage! He bellowed. Evelyn's heart seized. No, she screamed, stepping forward. Don't shoot. But the captain didn't hesitate. The rifle cracked. Tahan staggered back, a red bloom spreading across his shoulder. Something inside Evelyn broke wide open. She raised her rifle without thinking and fired. The shot struck the captain's hand, his weapon spinning into the dirt. The world roared back to life. Horses, screams, smoke. By the time it ended, the soldiers had retreated, dragging their wounded with them. The Comanche camp lay in ruin. Tents torn, fires smoldering, blood darkening the grass. Evelyn stumbled through the wreckage, searching until she found him. Tahan sat beneath a tree, blood staining his chest, but his eyes still clear. He looked up as she fell to her knees beside him. You fight, he murmured, a faint smile curving his lips. She pressed her shaking hands to the wound. Because you taught me how. He reached up, his fingers brushing her face. No more run, he whispered. You strong. You stay. Tears blurred her vision. Yes, she breathed. I stay. In the distance, the sun began to set, red as the blood on her hands, bright as the fire still burning in her heart. She had chosen. Not the world she was born into, but the one she had earned. And as Tahan leaned against her, breathing slow and shallow, Evelyn finally understood the truth of his people. Their strength wasn't in their weapons, but in their will to keep loving, even when the world tried to burn it away. The smoke rose from the plains for 3 days. The soldiers were gone, but they had left the kind of silence that only follows after blood. Evelyn tended to the wounded with the women, her hands raw from work, her dress stained with ash. The air reeked of sweat and gunpowder, but it was the silence that hurt most. The missing laughter of the children, the empty space where tents had stood, and Tahan lay beneath the shade of a cottonwood tree, his shoulder bound with leather and herbs. The healer said the bullet had missed his heart, but only barely. He would live if the spirits willed it. Evelyn sat beside him through the long days and longer nights, washing his wounds, feeding him water drop by drop, whispering prayers she no longer believed in. Sometimes he woke, eyes cloudy with fever, and murmured her name. Other times he simply reached for her hand in the dark, and she let him hold it until sleep claimed them both. On the morning of the 4th day, he opened his eyes fully. The fever had broken. The sky was a perfect, endless blue, and the wind carried the soft hum of the survivors rebuilding their camp. Evelyn was sitting cross-legged beside him, mending his torn tunic with thread she'd unraveled from her own hem. When she noticed his gaze, she smiled, small and weary. You should be resting, she said. I rest too long, he murmured, his voice rough from days of silence. You tired? I'm fine. He studied her for a long moment. Then in that calm, steady tone she'd come to know, he said, You saved me. She shook her head, tears threatening again. No, you saved me. You did it from the first night you opened that cellar door. He smiled faintly, the lines around his eyes softening. Maybe we save each other. The words hung between them, simple and sacred. By sunset, the tribe gathered to honor the dead. The drums began slowly, one heartbeat then another until the rhythm filled the air. Women carried baskets of wildflowers. Men painted their faces with ash and red earth. Evelyn stood among them, her hair braided with feathers Mahina had woven in. The scent of burning sage curled through the air. When the elder spoke, the people fell silent. She said words in Comanche that Evelyn did not understand, but she felt their weight, the promise of endurance, the memory of those lost, and the blessing of those who remained. Then the elder turned to Evelyn and Tahan. Mahina stepped forward, placing a hand on Evelyn's shoulder, her eyes glimmering. "Wolf and his woman," she said in broken English, "walk same path now." Evelyn's breath caught. The elder lifted a woven band of red and black hide and gestured for their hands. Tahan rose slowly, still weak but proud, his movements deliberate as he took Evelyn's hand. They stood together in the fading light, wind stirring the grass around them. The elder tied the band around their wrists, binding them with a knot that symbolized not possession but bond. There were no vows, no rings, no priest, only the earth beneath their feet, the sky above, and the beat of the drums echoing through both their chests. Tahan turned to her, his dark eyes steady. "You sure?" he asked softly. Evelyn nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I've never been more sure of anything." He reached up, brushing away a tear with his thumb. Then, in front of the tribe, he lifted her hands to his lips and kissed the scars on her wrist, those pale lines that had once told a story of pain. Now they spoke of survival. The drums grew louder, the voices rising in song. Someone began to dance, and then another, the rhythm rippling through the camp like wind through the tall grass. Evelyn leaned close and whispered, "What does my name mean now?" He smiled, a flash of light in his weary face. "It mean wife of the wolf," she laughed softly, resting her forehead against his. Around them, the tribe moved in a slow circle, singing for life, for loss, for love that endures like stone. As night fell, the stars shimmered above the endless plains. Evelyn looked up, the cool wind lifting her hair, and felt something vast and wordless settle in her chest, a peace that no sermon, no war, no fear could ever steal. She had crossed fire and blood to find it. Beside her, Tahan squeezed her hand. "We live," he whispered. She nodded, smiling through her tears. "Yes, we live." And when he kissed her one last time beneath the blanket of stars, the world seemed to hold its breath, as if even the earth knew it was witnessing a love strong enough to outlast the wind, the fire, and time itself.